Yes, thank you all for coming out. This is a very nice turnout for a Friday, a cold Friday morning. I'm Gary Tomlinson, by the way, the director of the Whitney Humanities Center. I didn't say that in either of my introductions for the last 2 days, not because I think I need no introduction, but simply because I forgot. But I am Gary Tomlinson at any rate. Welcome back. This is the final event of our Tanner Lectures this year, a roundtable discussion of Dipesh Chakrabarty's wonderful presentations over the last 2 days. The panelists this morning include Dipesh himself, of course, already introduced to you. I won't introduce him again. They include also, and you will forgive me if I keep these introductions brief so as to get right down to business, Daniel Lord Smail, Professor of History and current chair of that department at Harvard University. Dan's expertise reaches from the Middle Ages back through human history over the longest durée. Of his several books, his On Deep History and the Brain of 2008 was a bracing thought experiment in breaking down the borders between human and natural histories, an experiment that he has followed up and developed on in more recent work. Wai Chee Dimock, the William Lampson Professor of English and American Studies here at Yale, writes on American literatures and their interactions with law, science, philosophy, and global literatures. She is one of the directors of Yale's Literature, the Arts, and the Environment Colloquium. Michael Warner is the Seymour K. Knox Professor of English and American Studies at Yale. He brings social and critical theory to bear on many topics in American literature and has been particularly concerned in recent years with issues of secularism and the public sphere. He is presently teaching a wide-ranging seminar entitled Inventing the Environment in the Anthropocene. The general order of events this morning will be as follows. We're going to hear first from Dan Smail briefly. Dipesh will have an opportunity to respond to some of the questions and issues that Dan raises. Then we'll hear from Michael again briefly, and Dipesh will respond again. Then from Wai Chee, and Dipesh will respond once more. And at that point, we will open it up to the discussants more broadly and more flexibly and more fluidly. And finally, we will a little bit later on open it up to questions and comments from the floor. The last thing I will say is that at the end of it all, which depending upon how it goes, will be about noon or 12:15 at the latest, there will be snacks, sandwiches, coffee, and cookies and things like that in room 108 at the end of the hall. Everybody is invited. So let me turn it over to Dan to start with.
Without further ado. We didn't, Wai Chee and Michael, we didn't actually talk about whether we'd want to stand up for our very brief remarks. Did you have a feeling about this?
I don't care.
Yes, that will.
Would you mind if I stand up? Yeah, then I can exert my stomach muscles more.
Yeah.
Just thank you so much to Gary for the invitation to come here. It's a real honor. Dipesh was speaking yesterday about the idea, the dream of doing a Tanner lecture, and for me, I think the chance of doing a comment on a Tanner lecture is equally glorious. These remarks are really meant to, as Gary said, meant to be sort of conversation starters. And to that end, I for Dipesh, I have a question and have a parable. But I'd like to begin with just some thoughts about the aesthetics of the lectures. There's a beautiful aesthetic in it, Dipesh, of the universe in the teacup. And over the course of 2 days, you were bringing us into all of the many things that one can find in that particular teacup, the sort of the energy states of the molecules, the thermal vectors that are rising up, the flavor compounds, the interface between the milk and the tea, and those kinds of things. And the teacup, of course, was that single word common in the expression common and differentiated responsibilities. And the point here was that we understood the tea of the differentiated, but the common was empty and needed to be composed. And as we got to the end of your remarks on the second day, I think we were all, at least I was, on the edge of my seat because I was wondering, as you had gone into the extraordinary things you can find in that teacup, how are you going to bring it back to the common? And you did it in this, at least in the way that I read it, in this really beautiful way through the political, namely that there's a politics of the differentiated, and we know it only too well because it's the politics of paralysis. But can there be a politics of the common? Because there's no infrastructure. There's no limits to how far those politics might extend. They might go out to harmful microbes at the very extent of it. There's no ethics available for us. And there's no history. And as a historian, this is where I find myself engaging most. So you have this relationship with big history, which at once is welcoming. This is the falling into big history. But at the other sense is you have a strong sense of the inadequacy of this. So on the one hand, big history sets itself up as an alternative cosmology. But those histories are told on scales, as you say, that the human mind simply cannot fathom. And I was going to give you some more proof of this if you needed it. I was reading some work on the way in which people estimate large numbers. And it turns out that half of Americans, if asked to place 1 million between 1,000 and 1 billion, will put it halfway between. That's, as I said, I don't think you needed proof of this, but this is a proof of the difficulty we have of dealing with scale. So running through your two lectures is this powerful distinction between Homo and Anthropos. And at one point, you use a tectonic metaphor. You speak of the fault line that runs through Homo and Anthropos, the two figures of the human. And in a sense, if you didn't follow this metaphor, but one could think of these two plates that are now coming together in this grinding crash that is where epochal consciousness comes from. Now, you could have chosen different frames or metaphors. And so here's my question. Is this the right intellectual architecture for framing the Homo-Anthropos split? And to explain this question, I'll now offer you the parable of the cow. So I was spending some time just poking around on cows and digestion in the last few days. And let me let you know what I came up with. That dairy cows are responsible for producing 30 to 50 liters of gas per hour. It's a mixture of carbon dioxide and methane, which of course are greenhouse gases. And it turns out that in global emissions of greenhouse gases, cattle are responsible for 18% of it. Now, here's the question. Who is responsible for that gas? Now, running through my head was this a kind of an African folk tale. And what I had, this whole dialogue, which I won't give you because you can imagine yourself, was all the parts of the cow arguing who was responsible for the gas. The brain, the hooves, the teeth, the tail. They all say, in this debate, it is not our fault. It is the fault of the rumen. It is the rumen's fault for producing all this gas. We are not to blame. But the other barnyard animals looking on the cow said, no, it's all of you, the cow. All of your organs and your limbs share this responsibility in common. Now, in the meantime, what is the rumen saying? The rumen is saying, no, I'm not responsible. I'm merely the habitat for microbes. And it is they who produce the gas. And it turns out that there's between 1 to 10 billion bacteria per milliliter of stomach fluid in the rumen. So there's a hell of a lot of microbes in there. And the microbes, in turn, and you can see how this would go, would say, well, actually, no, it's only a part of us who is responsible for this. Now, if we choose to start at the molecular level, and then we move up the orders of magnitude, as we move up, actors come into view. A microbe, a rumen, a cow, a feedlot, global capitalism. But as we move up, entities that appeared as singular actors at one level resolve as mere components in the tissue of new actors. So they cease to be actors. It's a fractal pattern because there's self-similarity all across the orders of magnitude. So here's my question then rephrased. Why a metaphor of fault lines or binary divisions? There's a very binary division, almost a Cartesian division that you've set up as the intellectual architecture, the fundamental metaphor that runs through. Why that division as opposed to a metaphor of a fractal? Would it be possible to recompose the Homo and the Anthropos through the frame of the fractal? And if you did, then Homo would resolve itself as the figure of the human that is visible in the debates that go on inside the cow. And the Anthropos, in turn, would see the cow whose entire organism in common is responsible for its emissions. Now, I can anticipate one of your objections. I know you're writing this down as we speak right here, which is isn't this just Wilsonian consilience, where everything is subordinate to something higher up, ultimately to things like physics. And what I want to say here before you formulate this too much is that it's actually a false analogy, and that a better analogy is found in physics, where the strong force on the one hand and gravity on the other hand
operate in separate orders of magnitude that are appropriate to them and have no relevance outside that order. So it's not a question of dominance, of political dominance of a higher order of analysis over a lower one. This is simply a question of orders of explanation that are appropriate to their orders of magnitude. So if we accept the lessons of the parable of the cow, then responsibility can be assembled and disassembled as one travels across the scales of observation. So Dipesh's model, I think your model is sort of like a Necker's cube, where it's the same thing that is flipping in and out of different states depending on how you look at it. That kind of model disappears in favor of a historical optics that operate at different scales of observation, where actors and tensions and responsibilities vanish and reappear as we move across orders of magnitude. So I see this as a sort of a friendly amendment for some of the architecture. And as we were speaking earlier, it also has to do with what I wonder about the palimpsest of your thinking over the 5 or 10 years that you've been working on it, whether there's elements of ways of thinking that are no longer appropriate to the framework that you've actually developed here. And I'd love to hear you talk more about this. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Dan. I mean, for characteristically both generous and generously critical comments, which is exactly what one wants and needs. And so again, what we do in conversation is sometimes in trying to protect our individual intellectual projects, we translate the propositions of another project into the language of your own project, whatever, right? And so let me talk about the fault line, the beginning with binary. Beginning with binary, I always think of as as the first step in thinking. I mean, Hegel's logic is all about making distinctions, first-order distinctions, which then he himself would dissolve, right? But without first-order distinctions, as he said, all cows are black at night. So in a way, and as you know, mathematically, a binary can be converted into other orders. So a binary is not an essentialist structure in that sense. Mm-hmm. Right? But where I begin from, and something I come back to, and it's what I'm trying to problematize, not being a natural science person, and not doing natural science for the sake of doing natural science. So the stakes in the project, for me, come out of the way in which, as I said, I was jolted into an awareness of the geological and the biological kind of colliding with my sense of the historical, with my sense of the human historical. And the fact that that's happening in, as I said, in living memory, over the span of 1 or 2 generations. I mean, to think that a new geological epoch can be dated from 1945. The reason being that if future geologists come and look at this planet, then the order of difference between the Industrial Revolution and 1945 will not matter, because it's 1945 when they'll find geologically synchronous evidence of the changes we have made, right? Now, so my shock really was what I was calling being thrown, falling into, was really a jolt to my political consciousness. And that political consciousness had already been involved in an argument with the Latourian framework, in which it was very clear that the logical cognitive criticism of the inheritance of European natural philosophy, which from Cartesian times, not just the mind-body distinction, but his experiment in optics, and all of those things resulted in the creation of disciplines which artificially carved up nature into physics and chemistry. But this artificial carving up gave European powers initially, and everybody later, a tremendous capacity to manipulate the empirical world. And this is what created the desire in everybody to modernize. I mean, the first fascination in the history of Asian nations with Europe was to do with military technology. And by military technology, I not only mean weapons, but even discipline. I mean, in the 18th century, European mercenaries who couldn't find jobs in Europe, so kind of second-rate mercenaries, were all finding jobs in India, trying to modernize armies of Indian princes. And 18th century descriptions by Indian Muslim gentlemen going to England and looking at a cotton mill and being mesmerized by the discipline of the machinery, just visually mesmerized by so many arms of the machine working together in a particular rhythm. Almost sort of, you could read Marx's description of how the machine appropriates and builds the rhythm of the animal body first and then the human body into its own rhythm. And it was as though this 18th century gentleman whom I have in mind was completely mesmerized by the visual side of it. So in a sense, I begin from a world that had been created by this artificial carving up of nature into disciplines, into the scientific disciplines. So that even in high school when I read science, you had to know why physics was different from chemistry, right? And even as I was saying that climate change is about bringing physics, geology, biology together, right? So in a way, you're making that distinction and then dissolving them, trying to explain something like Earth system science or whatever. So in some ways, so my historiography came from that perception of the world made available to modernizing elites, including critiques of modernizers, throughout the world, who all somehow wanted the material benefits that came out of those distinctions in terms of human longevity, the capacity to sustain populations over a long time. So Indian population until 1947 remained static at 300 million, which is exactly the number of gods we are meant to have. So there was a time when we had more gods than people, and then by 47 we had the same number of people as gods, right? And the reason it remained static was because of famines in the 19th century and epidemics and pandemics in the 20th century. And after independence, what happens? In my lifetime, Indian population has grown more than 4 times. Mainly because, not because they could give nutrition to the poor, but they could save their lives. Right? Thanks to, medicine, production of food, agriculture, irrigation, green revolution, all of those things, right? And so what was coming into crisis for me was something that in my head, it felt like I had solved. Like I could go back to a Latour and say, look, of course what you're saying is right. Nature is not carved up into these disciplines. But there is a benefit of carving it up. If we act as though nature could be so carved up, then we produce better standards of living. And isn't that important? But suddenly to be confronted with this question, is it good to go on improving the standards of living of so many people? And I could not, within my moral universe that I inhabited, and politics is a branch of morality, right? Moral thinking. I could not answer that question. I mean, that's why I was saying there's genuine fear and trembling when I'm faced with that question. So that's why Amartya Sen is a very interesting case in point. He's devoted all his life to thinking about welfare economics, right? And thinking about welfare, thinking about what the normative sort of Rawlsian framework of justice and all of those questions. And now when he's faced with climate change, and that's why I was sort of using him a little bit to show the kind of problems that sort of thinking runs into. And so what you do with the cow and the human and the microbes and the fractals is really what I was trying to refer to as the idea of a subject dispersed and distributed over many life forms. And I was then saying, once you grant that kind of idea of subject, there's no corresponding idea of the political, there's no corresponding idea of governance. And that's where I find Latour is struggling. Again, he can create the actor network theory, and then when he's trying to create politics of nature and think about it, with all respect for him, I tremendously admire him, but I think there is a web of words that he has to create. He creates another alternative world to which you can only enter after you've taken language classes from him. And that's what his glossary is doing. So you have to sort of go sit down with him because he'll give you new acronyms. And into the book, like, Inquiry into Modes of Existence, you forget the acronyms. So you have to go back to the glossary all the time. So you're kind of constantly taking tutorials from him as to how to enter that world, right? So, and I think I read that and my quandary as symptomatic of a Heideggerian problem, that cognition falls short of the more immediate way in which moods disclose the world to me. Right? And therefore, it's very hard to create politics out of cognition alone. And that's why politics always has to come back and appeal to more than reason, to affect, to moods, to, persuading people is never just about cognition and just about logic, right? So in a way, so what I was, my falling into big history was about really the kind of the quandary of political thought and political awareness, because, I can't aspire to be a natural scientist, but I would read natural science, and that precisely, this is where your work and the big history work are all partners in this conversation. But at the same time, we come from different projects into the conversation, right? And so that's why I'm trying to translate your responses back to my concerns. Yeah. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Michael.
The notes I made last night begin with a summary of my take of what Dipesh is trying to do in these lectures. And so please forgive me, this might be slightly redundant to the conversation we just had, but I think it's still good to be clear about what the project is. So two quotations from yesterday's lecture, to me, really illustrate the dilemmas that Dipesh is trying to help us think through. And the first is the homocentric concern with justice, represented by Amartya Sen's remark that we need a normative framework that should recognize that growing need for energy consumptions by humans, if the masses of Africa, Asia, and Latin America are going to enjoy the fruits of human civilization and to acquire the capabilities needed for making truly democratic choices. That is a profound concern. The second is a zoocentric one in his language, and one quotation illustrating it is the one that comes from Václav Smil. If the billions of poor people in low-income countries were to claim even half the current per capita harvest prevailing in affluent economies, too little of the Earth's primary production would be left in its more or less natural state, and very little would remain for the mammalian species other than ours. You take those two concerns and put them together, and Dipesh sees that reconciling these points of view is made difficult by the fact that they do not understand humanity in the same way and cannot. And I think that's the impetus for coining these two terms, Homo and Anthropos. We could substitute a different scheme, I think, without objection if you wanted to call it Humanity 1 and Humanity 2. I think the point would be the same. And Dipesh's question is, who is that we? We are simultaneously a divided homocentric humanity and a dominant species, a part of the history of life on this planet, and a geological agent. With this collapsing of multiple chronologies, the human condition is change. And I think that it's the question of politics and ethics is thrown into disarray by that split imagination of the human subject. That, I think, I take to be the center of these lectures. Humanity 2, or the Anthropos, is not a political or ethical subject. Dipesh's language for it is quite interesting. Climate change as epical consciousness, then, is constituted around a split between the Homo, humanity as a divided political subject, and the Anthropos, collective and unintended forms of existence of the human. Now, collective and unintended, the collective is what inspires people to imagine a global subject, but unintended is what inhibits that project. So, our language of politics and ethics, of personhood, responsibility, and capabilities does not figure the dispersed subject of Humanity 2 or the Anthropos. Unlike almost everyone else who writes on this topic, Dipesh is engaging in a reflection that is neither normative nor predictive. And as he says in the Q&A yesterday, he is asking for a space before I become political. I'd like to linger with him in this project. He does not write the kind of we sentences that characterize most climate discourse. And I've noticed that those we sentences tend to fall in two different directions. One is a kind of directive steering sentence. We must do this. We must reduce our population in order to accommodate the carrying capacities of the Earth. And it seems to me that we sentences of that kind come very naturally to climate scientists because they inhabit the knowledge subject that faces the extremity. And because they are elites whose knowledge is conditioned by universities, among other things, and institutions of power in which it comes naturally for elites to think of themselves as steering. And if you read Lovelock, you see the really fascistic potential of a lot of these we sentences. But of course, there are we sentences on the other side of the spectrum, we sentences that are trying to conjure for us a global ethical subject, one that would be more responsive to a multi-species world, one that would be post-human, and so on. But that discourse, and we have a lot of it in the humanities, that discourse, to me, is beginning to look like two-degree thinking. That is, thinking predicated on a two-degree outcome of global warming over a long time frame. In what time frame do we expect a new global ethical subjectivity to be ushered in by North Atlantic intellectuals? So I think it's really bracing that Dipesh has asked us to stand back from both these kinds of thinking. And I thought it was very telling in the Q&A yesterday when you said, if my argument is right, it is about the difficulty of being ethical. And the closest I get to an ethical position is that of fear and trembling. Similarly, when one falls into big history, what unravels is the way one thought about politics. Now, so I would like to ask a little more about politics, given what you said, because the alternatives are not simply the kind of politics of care that would lead us to a more ethical subject where everyone, and to justice, where everyone has the same access to capabilities, nor is it entirely Schmidt's friend versus foe. Seems to me likely that whatever politics we would like to have, the politics of climate change will continue to be politics in the sense of generating conflicting interests as much as resolving them, and organizing resentments and struggles for mastery under conditions of scarcity. So if anyone was following the story about Sao Paulo's water supply in the New York Times a couple of days ago, I think it bears, it casts a kind of disturbing light on how these stories are likely to occur in the future. You know, Sao Paulo is facing a climate change-induced water crisis that's quite extreme by our developed nation standards. And what struck me was the way the journalist had no trouble in finding quotations like this one from a finance manager of an art gallery. I feel hatred of the governor and Sabesp, the utility company. I'd like to take them out and set fire to them. They completely failed to warn us and have just continued to lie about this throughout, which of course may be true. Yeah. But you see my point, that a lot of politics is people identifying their resentments. But rather than get predictive, and I don't want to say what will happen politically, but I would like to linger with Dipesh in this reflection, or this readjustment of our thought about what politics means. And in order to do this, I would like to invite us all to think about the date cited for the beginning of the Anthropocene, July 16th, 1945. What have been the conditions of politics since July 1945? Well, let me just name three. One is comparative peace. One doesn't have to think with Steven Pinker that violence is disappearing to realize that the living generations in developed countries have been able to think of politics under conditions in which wars are highly contained, often through proxies, in places that do not threaten domestic populations of prosperous nations. Peace has been, for most of us, a taken for granted and untheorized condition of politics. Mm-hmm. Two, and related, large and strong states. This is the era of welfare democracies and state capitalist regimes like China and the former Soviet Union. Three, internationalism. July 1945 is an interesting date because in October 1945, the UN was founded, and most of our climate diplomacy and discourse is now channeled through the UN. So climate change and our fall into big history may have the effect of reinforcing these trends, especially the last one, internationalism. But think about how the conditions of human adaptation include political and social institutions that will inevitably be destabilized, especially if population contraction is envisaged. And I think that Dipesh and I similarly recoil from the language of population contraction as something that might be strategized. In this connection, I think it's worth remembering the point that Dipesh made, which is that humanity cannot survive without the technosphere, without the set of large-scale network technologies that underlie and make possible rapid extraction from the Earth of large quantities of free energy and long-distance communication and so on. One might even ask the question, do we have a responsibility to the technosphere, since so much life depends on it at this point, and it's very difficult to imagine any room for maneuver in adaptation without it. The technosphere is entirely dependent on those strong states and some form or another of capitalism. I don't mean market capitalism or liberal capitalism. China counts as a kind of state capitalism in this respect. So just one more quote from Dipesh, and then I'll ask us to think about what we understand politics to be in this world. And it's our search for climate justice and its attendant politics may very well mean that we have to travel the Via Dolorosa of dangerous climate change. Perhaps our struggle for climate justice will have to be conducted in a world that is even more climate stressed and far more unjust than the one we have at present. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Again, thanks for the thoughts, and I agree with almost everything you said. The coming world is going to make it more difficult for us to be the kind of ethical subjects, the possibilities of being ethical subjects that we have so far entertained, and the comportments that we've wanted to assume, even Foucault's discussion of ethicality. I think the coming world is going to make it more difficult because one is actually no longer placed within biopolitics, and one is no longer discussing the good life in the city and what it should be like. One is in that larger realm of life of which we cannot quite compose the politics yet, or an ethics yet, because its life forms are clashing. And so that I think is a completely shared project. And the fact is that the peace narrative that many of us have grown up with in many parts of the world, not in every part of the world. I mean, some parts of the world, I think people haven't grown up with peace narratives, like in Israel and Palestine. But we have, both, not just in the West, but in China, in India, and we've often felt very grateful. I mean, my generation didn't see depression. My father was without a job for 6 years after his master's degree. We didn't see famines. we had some war, but they were mainly border wars with China and Pakistan. But wars never touched us in that deep sense. Whereas there are other places that have actually people have grown up differently, and I think that's, when the Charlie Hebdo thing happened, I was speaking to a Bangladeshi friend in England, and he said to me, he called me Dipesh Da, which is an older brother figure, and he said, Dipesh Da, he's a Muslim person, and he said, I came away from Bangladesh to Durham, where he lives. And he said, I've been living here for 18 years, and in these 18 years, only 4 or 5 times, perhaps, buses have failed to come on time. In my 18 years, I've assumed a life where I go to the bus stop, look at my timetable, and the bus comes. Whereas there are many people who don't have these certainties in their lives. And I keep on thinking, by what right can I hang on to this world of certainties, while majority don't have them? And at the same time, I said to him, but Zaman, it doesn't mean that you desire that uncertainty, because you came to Durham thinking of the future of your children. And you sort of desire that certainty for their worlds too. And he said, yeah, I'm totally caught in this. That on the one hand, I realize that this is the privilege of a minority for which I'm very grateful, and I've joined the minority. But at the same time, it seems unsustainable as there are more people, wanting to come in. And this is something we all have to think through. So in some respects, if the tendency towards cutting the democratic process short, as you said, is totally built into a lot of scientists' thinking. So actually, when Tim Flannery wrote one of the first popular books on climate change, called The Weathermakers, the Weathermakers, after Future Readers, The Weathermakers, you'd see that Weathermakers actually has a chapter called Carbon Dictatorship. Yeah. And I read that and I thought, Tim, you know carbon, but you don't know about dictatorship. How can you simply talk about carbon dictatorship? On the other hand, people have come out of fascism, of Nazism, or the Soviet Union, or even other authoritarian regimes have some idea of what it means in everyday life as human beings. So I totally agree with you that that's where the scientist's social thought has to be modified by criticism. But on the other hand, it is true that if you're going to the politics of, suppose we go down that sad path of more climate change and a climate stressed world, and here I find the debate about the Anthropocene between Clive Hamilton and others very instructive, because the argument is this, you see, even purely at the level of technology. If we have enough time to shift over to renewables before, let's say, more than 2-degree warming sets in, the nations that will make more profit out of the transition will not include the United States. The Chinese are much more advanced with their renewables technology, selling them. The Europeans are making them, right? Solar, Chinese are, very far advanced, selling them aggressively in places. And more cities think that, one way to solve the electricity problem is to get away from the grid and have solar, rooftop panels. The Chinese are there. Americans lost the chance. Obama, the first elections, the dream was that the Americans would produce this technology and sell it to the world because of the close connection between universities, research, and industries. But we missed that because we went for fracking, we went for other options, right, for cheap energy. So if global warming becomes an emergency, like, we need to buy more time, then we will go for geoengineering. The country that has more at its disposal in terms of transitioning to geoengineering is United States. So geoengineering actually is more a kind of strategic, it's more an argument in which very powerful interests in America will be invested. Because that way you also buy time for the US domination, at least you think you will.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Of the planet and for maintenance of the US lifestyle. So there's very interesting politics there. Yeah. But at the same time, when anthropologists in India have studied childhood in middle-class families, like my kind of families, compared with childhood in slums. So they discover that, the more you're resource endowed, the more children are actually socialized into being declawed, right? Instead of, I mean, your parents will say, don't fight. You stop fighting, and they find that in the slums, parents, they don't stop fights between kids. Because kids will have to fight all their life. There's fights over tap water, they fight over every resources. So they bring up children to actually fight. And when I read about Mughal history, the time, I hate the Mughal times because every 2 years there's a war in this area, that area. If you're a noble person in the court, you had to, even before the Mughals, with the Muslim rule, the wonderful historian who writes about the older period, the Sultanate period, no, actually Akbar's time, and he was a court poet, and he realized that every other noble was actually getting more land grant, making more money, but he wasn't. And he asked people around, why am I not getting promotion? It's like a promotional system. And people said, because you don't fight. You have to hold the soldier, for the sword for the emperor. You have to wield the sword. So this was the kind of there was a system before the British came where learning to kill was part, it's like the knightly system, was part of being a gentleman, part of being an aristocrat, was that you learned how to kill. And if you didn't go up in the world. And in some ways, I think if the world gets more stressed, we will get less declawed. So the questions of civility, all of those things that we've come to value are at stake. And that's why it's very important, I think, that we fight to keep these values. We fight as far as possible for a more democratic solution to this. That's why the Homo question will never go away, right? In other words, because all of our values, when they say this is threatening civilization, it's not just monuments and the sea level rising, but it's actually threatening our values. It's threatening the values of peace. It's threatening how you want to see fellow human beings. All of these things, and that's why I think it's. But at the same time, as we cannot begin to even think about that politics without acknowledging the crisis for political thought that it presents at the same time. So I'm kind of trying to take the very basic first step of acknowledging the crisis against much resistance, because people want to say that we already have those resources. We just have to go out and. But there might be need for messianic leaderships. There might be all kinds of moments of political journey ahead of us.
Wai Chee?
Oh, thank you. So, I guess I'm still speaking into my microphone. I've revised my comments somewhat in response to what we've been talking about today. And so what I want to start with really is just the observation that Dipesh is absolutely right. This is a situation in which vested interests are involved. In many ways, they are the ones that are dominating the conversation at this moment. And so the question is, how do we mobilize enough people so that there could be a fighting chance for this not to go entirely the other way? So it's really a question of the field being dominated by vested interests and various environmental voices being silent at the moment. So I want to think about this question in terms of mass mobilization. How do we get lots and lots of people to get involved and turn the question of climate change into something with enough mass momentum as Vietnam, for instance, in the 60s, right? That was a question that was the people think about day and night. It was visible on the streets. It was visible in music, in film, in art. So how to get climate change to have that kind of magnitude. So I want to think about this in terms of three questions. One is visualization. This is something that Dipesh talked about in his first lecture. That climate change isn't something that we can see. It's not something that we have a gut reaction to us. So how do we get climate change, turn it into something that is observable within human optics? I think the problem is that human optics are not conditioned to register something like climate change because effects are so far into the future, right? You know, the really severe effects are 50 years into the future. So our optics are not trained to observe that kind of phenomenon. So the question is to turn what is unobservable into an observable phenomenon, and visualization is crucial. And I think that in some sense it's also addressing Dan's observations about, you know, how to turn this into a kind of scalable problem, right? You know, it's right now the problem is that, you know, we're humans, we operate at one scale, and then climate change, I mean, I'm oversimplifying your point, but climate change is really operating on a somewhat different scale. You know, it's the problem of incommensurate scales. So how to find something that actually is observable on all scales? And I think that the best candidate for that would be visual data. I think that, you know, from the standpoint of evolution, you know, our people certainly could see things a lot for a much longer time than they had the language to talk about those things. So the linguistic register is grossly inadequate register to think about climate change. We need to go back to something that is a more robust foundation in terms of evolution, which is the visual. So, you know, how to turn climate change into a visual problem. I think that that's something that we need to, all of us need to think about. And so that brings me to my second point, which is re-education. I think that the question came up yesterday, that climate change is not a departmental problem. It's not something that could be tackled within a single discipline. And just the problem of visualization, especially some kind of visual pedagogy that will enable us to educate our students in such a way so that they can actually see this thing. Professors are not currently equipped to do that kind of teaching. You know, we need to know a lot more about neuroscience to know the impact of visual input. You know, what kind of input does visual data have on recipients? That's something I know nothing about. You know, I need to be retrained. All of us need to be retrained. It's not just art historians that need to know about visual operations, but all of us do. So, you know, how do professors retrain themselves? How do we rethink, you know, what students ought to be learning? What's the takeaway from each class? You know, I think that we also need to think about that. I mean, you know, we just go in thinking that, okay, you know, we just give them all this stuff, and that's the end of it. That should just be the beginning. The takeaway for each student ought to be the front and center in the way that we think about education. And I guess related to that is my third question, which is about interactivity. You know, I think that at this point, I think we really need to take advantage of every single medium that is at our disposal. And so the digital medium, social media, you know, anything else that comes up, you know, we don't know what the next big thing is, you know, but something comparable to Facebook, to anything. You know, all of those things ought to be part of our conversation, you know, how to work the question of climate change or use those as the platforms to think about climate change. You know, so how to think about the digital medium at this present moment and, you know, possible other media in the future. I'm just going to stop there.
Thanks, Wai Chee, for those remarks. And again, I'm in spirit with you. Just one or two responses on the question of visualization, which relates both to optics, as you said, and as well as to concepts like numbers. I mean, Dan raised that question about what people do with numbers and how we sense numbers, about difference between billion and trillion and million. Those sorts of questions, and the question of training. Actually, we had very interesting discussion over lunch yesterday about training, both graduate students, undergraduates, and faculty. And Dan had some interesting ideas, which I suppose will come up in discussions about how do you create time within time and opportunities within our present structures for retooling. So you need to those are practical questions to be thought, but I think the point is taken. But let me begin with the story about numbers. It's an Indian joke, but the joke actually tells you something about how numbers work in popular consciousness, even big numbers, and don't. And of course, when people work with numbers, even economic historians who work with numbers, I mean, one set of numbers make sense because they relate to another set of numbers. So like how many people were killed in the Ukrainian famine in Stalin's Russia is connected to history of the labor market, right? So basically, how many people killed, whether it was 8 million or 12 million or whatever, that will have some significance if you're a student of the labor market and supply of labor. So numbers relate to numbers. But for most of us, we don't work with numbers. Numbers take on other kind of significance. So this is a story about Indian civilization and our pride in the ancientness of our civilization. That this Indian guy is taking this American tourist around and points to a building and said, we're such an ancient civilization, that building there is 3,004 years old. So the American guy says, I get 3,000, but where do you get the 4? I mean, how can you be so precise? And he says, well, it's been 4 years since somebody told me it was 3,000 years old, right? But what it means that the 3 could have been 5, 3 could have been 7, but we have a sense of ancientness. So there is a kind of non-quantitative sense of distance in time and proximity in time, where numbers can have a sort of cultural play in it. So it goes back to the question of visualizing. So this guy, so somehow 3,000 appealed to him emotionally, and sort of, he could, like our present Prime Minister says that, you can puff up your chest and say. But it goes back to the question. The point I want to respond to is that, as you said, Wai Chee, that our optics are probably hardwired for something else, etc., etc. But the point I was trying to make with big history and falling into it is that during the Vietnam War, which we grew up with, these questions of our evolved traits did not come up, right? The ways in which people wrote poetry about Vietnam, and the photographs were there, and some of those photographs are actually sort of etched into our consciousness. But somehow the problem was of a nature where you wouldn't have stood up and made that statement, which actually shows there's a different kind of crisis where even somebody like you from a literature, humanities background is still, you're living in a situation where these ideas from evolutionary biology or whatever are swimming around us, right? So this question comes up, are we, because when you read about the problems of visualizing climate change, you read about the Doppler effect, you read about whether our danger sensing mechanism is so hardwired that we sense a danger only when it's completely upon us, but we don't see it coming incrementally, so problems of perceptions of exponential changes. So I'm just saying that for me that was an interesting moment in what you said, which is really like this stuff has moved close to us. So if you think of thoughtscape as geologically, right, then you kind of it's as if the continents have moved around. I mean, the continent of evolutionary biology, or whatever you want to call it, evolutionary studies, is suddenly close to the continent called humanities. Much more close than it was during the Vietnam crisis. So, and that, for me, is an interesting sense of the times that I was talking about. But just going back to one point that I think Michael made before about, yes, I think I totally agree with you. I think big history, deep history are, as I say, we're all swimming in it. It's all around us. And I think that's why it's wonderful to read Dan. It's wonderful to read big historians. But I think the flip side of it, which sometimes comes up in Dan's work, not in the book so much, but in the introduction to the Shyrock Smail volume. But it comes up even more clearly in David Christian. Sometimes there's a position that somehow this is ethically better or stronger. I mean, they have a critique of not subaltern studies, but like how subaltern history brought back Hegelianism. You have some lines which I'm going to sometimes sit down with and critique, but you can be, because they misses out on the impact of post-structuralism and anti-Hegelianism in subaltern studies. But there is a kind of gesture that even they make, that this is somehow better history, and better as a better education for us. And so there is this claim of being better, as distinct from the claim of saying, look, this is factually true. And these are two separate claims, and I find the first claim more criticizable. But that we need to know about this. That these facts are in a sense upon us. I don't dispute in any sense. So I don't think we can do without deep history and big history. But the claims made inside those strands of thought are not necessarily not open to criticism. The ethical points.
So which of you would like to lead in?
Well, I notice we've taken a fair amount of time already, and
Yeah, maybe-
perhaps
Yeah, maybe the
people
question-
are.
Well, let's take another 5 or 10 minutes here, and then
Okay.
we'll turn it over, turn it out to the audience. Are there Dan, you want to?
Well, look, I have lots of thoughts. I've been having thoughts bubbling over these last 3 days, in fact, and so it's a little bit difficult to know where to begin. I was thinking, I was really struck, Dipesh, by what you said about the sensation of falling into big history. And the image of falling is a really appropriate one because it's not stepping into it. There's a floor.
Yeah.
It's a falling.
Yeah.
And that, I think of that as a way of explaining how there isn't any net or structure to catch me when I move into it. What that made me think of was this whole point about what happened, to the extent that I understand it, in European and American culture in the 19th century, or even starting in the 18th century, when the fact of deep time became clear and undeniable. Now, if you look in certain kinds of writings, especially after the banner year of 1859, which is when 3 major volumes come out that really nail it down. If you look at the subsequent writings of historians, you get a sense that they're all having this feeling,
That's very interesting.
this trauma of falling into history. What happened, and this is what I've tried to sketch out. I don't think I've done it very well. I think it needs to be done by people who are really good at this kind of work, and I'm
It's very
I dabble
point.
in it. But
It's a very
one of the solutions that they came up with was to bracket the biological past from the cultural past. And they created that really hard line, which appeared in textbooks
and in
at
Collingwood,
exactly that time.
And Collingwood is the climactic point of that philosophy.
Well, Collingwood is, but even more so, it's Gordon Childe Mann-Mix himself, who creates the agricultural revolution as the moment at which history could be said to have begun in some real way. So I see it. I'm not sure whether a fashionable word like trauma. I find myself calling it the trauma of deep time. I'm not sure that's the right word because there's more of a falling or or of a sense of nothing being there to support me. And whether it's traumatic or not, I don't know, because I think for some people it's exhilarating. I mean, I find it exhilarating.
And you learn to swim. I mean, you learn to float up.
So the really important thing, I'm really wandering around the subject, but the important thing was the way in which this line inserted itself in history, and it bracketed out the biological, which was instantiated in departmental thinking, in human evolutionary biology and archaeology on the one hand, and in history and culture and literary studies on the other hand. And that made it safe. That was the way in which this trauma was sort of
dealt
overcome.
with.
What that obviously is, it's a nature-culture distinction. It's a subject-object distinction. It's what Latour is trying to get over as well.
The only one point I would make is that the title that Gordon Childe, I don't know if he did it consciously, but the title he gave to that book is such a Viconian title.
Yes, it is.
So it's a peculiar way in which Vico sort of suddenly turns up.
That's right.
In man makes himself, and that's a phrase that Marx is using in the 18th Brumaire, saying man makes himself, but not in any which way, but in the circumstance in which he finds himself. So
there's
that strand of Vico running through this, going through Croce, and then Croce gets translated by Collingwood and then turning up into Collingwood's philosophy is the idea of history.
That's right. That's right. So what you're doing, that's not what you're doing. What you're actually doing is speaking about them in ways where, as you say, big history is right here with us. Right. It's not a type of history where it's bracketed off.
Right.
But that was where what I was trying to say is to think of it in terms of this fractal pattern.
Right.
Actually is a friendly amendment, because it's actually, I think, the way in which you're structuring it.
Yeah.
What you do is you think about the time scales,
Yeah.
and that the time scales appropriate to history. But we don't end up with just two. We end up with this constant layer cake, which can take us down to family histories and genealogies and biographies.
The two had to do with my lingering investment
No, I completely
in
understood
political.
that. You explained it really well.
Yeah.
It's sort of a pragmatic solution. In other words,
Exactly.
whether or not it's real, it has real world
Exactly, real
consequences.
consequences.
And therefore it becomes real. It becomes consequences.
Yeah.
Can I say a brief word about the fractal? The way that we can think about deep time in terms of kind of fractal pattern. And it goes back to what you said about the blurring of the boundaries between natural history and human history, right? That has been the norm for historians, is that you bracket off prehistory, you bracket off ancient, pre-linguistic history to some extent, and say that's really not part of the province of history, which is also another way of saying that natural sciences are bracketed. The whole foundation of the university is based on the separation between the natural sciences and the human sciences and the humanities. And it seems that one way to think about deep time is actually to go back to a point where those divisions were not in place. And that actually brings us back to the question of reorganization of knowledge and restructuring of knowledge. Is that actually at this point, I think for us to be adequate at what we are doing, namely to be able to teach, my class in a way that is adequate to the 21st century, I do need to know something about cognitive science, neuroscience. I need to know something about human physiology. I need to know something about the physics and geophysics of planetary processes. That's the baseline for a good professor to teach a class in the 21st century. And I'm just absolutely not trained for that. That's not part of my job requirement. It's not part of my job description. We're still looking for people, who are defining very traditional terms. That's not doing us any good. So it really is, I think that the consequences of rethinking the separation between natural history and human history, those consequences are vast. And they really cut at the very foundation of the modern university.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more.
Michael, do you want to leap in briefly before we open it out?
No, I think we should open it up.
Okay. All right. Questions from the floor. There are microphones on both sides. Please use them if you want to ask a question.
I had a question about a distinction that you didn't talk about that has been in my mind recently, because I've been reading some recent work by Akhil Bilgrami about Gandhi and Marx. And he talks, Bilgrami talks a lot about commonality between Gandhi and Marx, and that they're both working at diagnosing a process by which we became alienated from nature and from each other, and a kind of common critique of modernity whose payoff for Bilgrami is this notion of an unalienated life, of a kind of a form of subjectivity that is back in touch with certain kinds of normative solicitations from nature that we forgot how to look for when we became kind of started to look at ourselves from a third personal point of view. That's the kind of Bilgrami line. It's a line that's similar to, I think, a kind of critique of a scientific understanding of language that Charles Taylor has made. And when you ended yesterday by coming to Heidegger, I kind of thought that you were saying that something in the spirit of those kinds of critiques of a kind of third personal perspective on human experience, that this kind of new predicament that we're in forces us back into a first personal condition of thrownness. But there's also, in addition to that first personal experience, the way I understood you to be talking about the Anthropos was that part of that condition is that we have this third personal view on ourselves, and that we're forced to. by virtue of the things that we know about the history of the planet, which are undeniable in a certain sense. So on the one hand, it seems like I'm a little confused because you seem drawn to this first personal language of thrownness, but that condition is partly about this third person observation of ourselves.
I think the question is enunciated, is it not?
Yeah.
Can you let him?
I could, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Was it the book on Gandhi and Marx? Who was that by?
Akil.
Oh, Akil Bilgrami. Okay. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Well, I mean, Akil's. I mean, I haven't read the book. I've read a couple of chapters out of it when he was publishing them as articles while he was working on the book. I'm not. The chapters I was reading were not engaging with the climate crisis in any way. I mean, Akil has since been interested in the climate crisis. So maybe in the book it comes up more clearly. Now, the one problem that I learned from reading climate scientists and others commenting on the current crisis is that that if you decentralized the world economy, which is what Gandhi's vision would have been, if you now decentralized it, and Gandhi's on record saying, "I wish," how people say world has become very small, it's become like a village, and Gandhi's on record saying, "I wish the world would get bigger." Actually, you would have population crashes. Because the argument is that you can't support human population on this scale by, growing vegetables in your backyard. So actually, any time you have a population increase, the need for accumulation goes up. And also to manage a population, as I was saying, you need larger energy-consuming bureaucracies that would simply keep the population alive. Sorry, Michael.
Well, this connects with the issue that I was trying to raise, which is that most of our political and ethical instincts have to do with some kind of repair, and the dominant discourses in the humanities. Akil is brilliantly synthesizing a couple of them in those essays. Create a kind of a no longer viable vision, I think, of rolling back some aspect or another of modernity, whether it's instrumental rationality, whether it's growth capitalism, whether it's the technocratic administration of life. Those have been the utopias driving left criticism for a long time.
Actually, it also
they no longer seem to be on the
but
table.
some of this actually applies to Bill McKibben as well, at least in the book, The Earth. With he ends up with sort of Jeffersonian plans for backward backyard gardening and things. And I think so. There's a long tradition of that romantic vision, right, of going back to nature in that sort of way. And I think you will basically risk the lives of a lot of people if you did that.
I wanted to ask for Michael and Wai Chee to kind of bring their comments together around one particular visualization, which is the Doomsday Clock. And I'm thinking about the July 1945 moment as being in the immediate aftermath of Holocaust historiography and liberation narratives, and in the immediate prehistory of the atomic moment. And it seems like the atomic timescale and the genocide timescales that have inflected our thinking about catastrophe up until the 1990s have now been incorporated in a kind of messy or uneven way into the timescales of climate change. And so I was wondering whether you could think about the implications or the inflections that the atomic or the genocidal have upon our risk calculation of climate change as we linger in the pre-political, as Dipesh has asked us so provocatively to do.
Boy, that's a huge question. I don't even know where to start with it. But one thing to observe is that the alarm over nuclear arms created a lot of the structures of discourse that we're still working with, including that global we. I have an anthropologist friend named Greg Urban who did a brilliant analysis of Jonathan Schell's book about global nuclear disaster. analyzing the we, there's a kind of imaginary or agential we that gets projected out of the spectacle of its own destruction, and that then organizes all of his rhetoric. Well, we're still, I think that's the origin of all the we sentences I've been noticing in climate discourse. But you're asking about the time frame, because there you, with genocide and with nuclear war, you can imagine a kind of proximate punctual event of danger. And that's not what we're looking at. Is that the question?
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
it seems like the actual
Yeah,
visualization
yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah, 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 yeah.
20, 30, 50, and 100 year timeline.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
exactly.
and the disaster does not affect the entire global population at the same moment, or at the same rate, or in the same way. So,
Right, but in terms of the time scale, though, those are instantaneous, right? You know,
Yeah.
I mean, the Holocaust is so visualizable. All you can show is the teeth, you know, from, you know, I mean, in fact, it's completely cinematic. I mean, I think that's why there's so many films about the Holocaust. Likewise, the atomic bomb. I mean, you know, even a non-visual representation like John Hershey's Hiroshima, that is a completely visual text, because you can, I mean, it's naturally visual in the sense that you can see the skin, you know, ripping off the bodies. And also it's instantaneous. So the time frame is actually very, very short. And if those were the two things that could be called global catastrophes, the conditioning, conception of catastrophe right now, then those are really inadequate models. I mean, I think that that's what you're getting at. Is that, you know, we're so used to thinking in terms of the Holocaust, in terms of the atomic bomb, that we really need to recondition ourselves to think about something that is, you know, say 50 years ahead, right? But some countries have already done that. The Netherlands has done that, you know, and because half its country is going to be underwater, you know, if the sea level rise were to proceed, you know, even at an extremely conservative rate. You know, so they are actually they're planning for 50 years ahead. They're relocating the populations right now. You know, they're being compensated, but there's no option for them not to be relocated in the Netherlands. So that's one country's very, very serious response to something that is completely not visualizable at the moment. And I think that because the Netherlands has been so historically used to water as something that you need to live with, that there's no way to run away from it. There's no way to look away from it. It's just a kind of non-human fact that, you know, that human beings have to weave into the human calculations. And I don't think that we are currently in that frame of mind. You know, so that's why I do think that the education has a role to play, because if the Netherlands, I mean, it's not as if they're different species of human beings, they're just human, just like us. It's just that they've been re-educated, you know, to accept water as a daily fact of life. You know, it's part of very rational calculus, and we are not in the habit of doing that.
Just to actually connect it up with the question I didn't answer, the second question, but going back to what Wai Chee was saying, the one problem with global warming is that there is not yet an emergent shared global chronology of the warming. First of all, you don't know, you have scenarios. There's no certain one scenario of when the warming might go which way, right? And secondly, you have countries who are applying the narrative of growth to the narrative of global warming. So just as India would say, okay, it's now our turn to grow. And later on, we will say it's now our turn to have global warming. Right? You guys are having global warming in the West, but, you know, we're not really having it, or it's not an issue. Right? So it's in a way unlike the Vietnam War again.
Dipesh, could I ask you a question? You talked about this from the point of view of India,
Right.
In the lectures. Well, India is now facing a wave of displaced people from Bangladesh, and they're militarizing their border. And like most developed countries, their military has a plan for securitizing climate change.
Yeah.
So,
But at the public level, it becomes a discourse about illegal immigrants.
I'm sorry?
In the public level, in the public sphere, it becomes a discussion about illegal immigrants. So India is actually buying border controlling technology from Israel.
But the problem of Bangladesh
the question was
is
timescales.
like the Netherlands.
Is that it's our turn to grow?
Yeah.
Is that 2-degree thinking? And
it's almost sort of no degree thinking. Like,
no degree
or
thinking,
kind of, it's like, it is not, I read the Indian newspapers every day. It's not an issue.
Yeah.
It comes up when Paris comes up or Copenhagen comes up. And then there are a few op-eds saying, we must insist on the differentiated responsibility principle. These guys have to pay. But what I'm saying is, going back to your first question, is that, so my point was really, I was not talking about the general human condition, I was talking about the human condition as a subject for thinking, for thinkers, of, kind of, people who think about history, human history. So I was, as Michael said, I was asking for by going via Jaspers, I was asking for a space within which to think, because I think while there are these politically important statements being made, it's clear that many governments of countries that matter, see, 1/5 of humanity actually emit 90% of greenhouse gases. About 12 to 14 nations emit 90% of greenhouse, India and China are included. Most nations are not emitters. Now, even within the emitter nations, some powerful countries like India don't want to take responsibility, even at a national level. Right? So you can see how difficult it is. So, it's like we'll train here, we'll create other kinds of awareness, and sure, some students will come from South Asia, pick it up, but it's a very slow process of that percolating back. I now go back to India, and I now find people who've read my climate piece, which actually an Indian journal refused to publish when I first wrote it. They said it's not, you're not addressing our issues. So there's all this sort of décalage of global time.
Thanks for the discussion, which is fascinating. Maybe against the grain of my own intuitions and the point that you, I think, made in the lectures extremely convincingly, let me suggest a way or a few ways in which I thought you also mentioned moments in which the two positions that clash might actually be brought together on a different level. So even when you emphasize the role in which our agency is both intellectually and practically undermined by its exercise, there still seems to be a moment in which you insist, in which the homocentric view has not just kind of a traditional habitus that we need to get rid of, but is actually intellectually justified in as far that we are aware of the agency that we have undermining itself.
Right.
So there is a self-reflexivity that does mark us out,
Right.
which is then exactly the point that I guess makes you comfortable in insisting on the homocentric view as deeply ethical and politically, not just out of conventionality, but out of an awareness and difficulty of the situation they're in. So I wanted to ask, if that is the case, theoretically, what would be the right level for thinking that together, of justifying a homocentric view, not out of traditional reflexes, but out of a new awareness that could justify it? And then maybe more practically, there were moments when you gestured towards new ways of conceiving of our own mastery of species and the world. And you dismissed them mostly by reference to technological limits, the difficulty of knowing how we affect other species. But are there also intellectual limits to this? What is your take on that kind of option?
Well, there are two questions. I mean, so basically what I was doing was, yes, there is, for many, this cognitive awareness that can't be. So that's where I was bringing Heidegger in to say that why cognition falls short of politics, because what he calls moods intervene. And that's why I was saying we have to take denial seriously as a human response, skepticism seriously as a human response. So in effect, you can't create a politics denying these moods, right? I mean, you might want to defeat a denialist, but you have to acknowledge their presence. Or you have to then, understand what denialism does. So that's why I was trying to argue that, following Heidegger, that cognition itself, even though I've fallen into the history, then I encounter all these moods. And of course, the zoecentrism puts even the moods question in question, because the subject of the zoecentric view, what I was calling the dispersed the subject dispersed over multiple species, right? And the second question as to what, I mean, that is also the Latourian question. How do you compose something that involves these, not just even a species. So the one question I was raising was about viruses, which are considered like between living and non-living entities, but which have an impact on life. Right? That's where I think I don't have an answer. I mean, that's the question. I agree with that, with the question. And that's where I was thinking that, okay, if we recognize that as part of the space I'm calling epochal consciousness, then what one is doing is what Michael described beautifully, actually, a very contradictory move. You're asking for patience while faced with an emergency. Right? And because what happens is you don't ask for patience, then I find as a thinker, all the old habits of thought rush in to take the place of that which needs to be thought.
But aren't you also saying that, I mean, I think that you are in fact talking about a level of human agency that needs to be reaffirmed at this moment, right? That kind of homocentric paradigm is not to be dispensed
No,
with
we can't
at this
dispense it.
moment.
That's
No.
why I was saying that,
in fact,
I mean,
action
we can't
is
dispense
completely
it.
human-centered.
Yeah. I mean, if we could dispense it, then the problem would be even worse.
Right.
Because this question, what can we do? What do we do? Is an insistent human question. I don't think there's in the same way that there's no getting away from denialism, in the same way there's no getting away from this question. What can we do? But you see, in India, the national mood is one of denial. There's not so much of skepticism or of indifference.
It's not just a means question. And this is why it's not, I
Right.
think what Dipesh is really challenging us to is not just thinking about how
Right.
we can mobilize
Yeah.
people.
No.
It's
No,
an
but
ends
it's-
question.
It's an ends question.
And it maps actually to a large degree on the debate among climate scientists about whether we are trying to save the Earth from humans or for humans.
Right.
And
Right.
and really that's kind of
that-
an irresolvable problem right now.
That's an unresolvable
yeah,
problem at the moment.
yeah,
That's what I'm saying.
yeah.
That's why it sort of brings political responses into a deep sense of crisis. But on the other hand, faced with an emergency, it's not like you do things out of habit. So in a way, what has happened is political thought has become habitual thought. And sometimes my problem with talking to Marxist friends or whatever is to get them to see that they're doing habitual thinking rather than actually thinking.
Thank you very much. So I see that this crisis, you may have fallen into big history, but environmentalists have been pushed into politics and economics. And so we have started to reimagine our environmental problems as mismanagement, as market failures. And the solution is then rooted in this management discourse, in bringing in externalities. And what we kind of envision is a design nature that is friendly to other species, but while ultimately serving our own aims and eco-friendly shopping and all of these very individualistic things. So we have this paradox where we are both the makers of the earth, but also at the mercy of our mistakes. Much like in Adam Smith's Perfect Market, we are both, the individual actions kind of create this larger system. So it strikes me that the Anthropocene is a very neoliberal project, and I was just curious on your thoughts on that.
I mean, the Anthropocene has a deep connection to neoliberal project if you're dating it from post-45. So even the Great Acceleration thesis is about the neoliberal economy. So if you follow the curves, the rise in consumption, the rise in emissions, all have to do with opening up of economies and the connection between economies. So in that sense, you're totally right. But on the other hand, where an economic explanation, as I was saying, meets its limits is that the planet needs to do things for us to be in the Anthropocene. In other words, when you date Anthropocene from, how much the planet warms depends on many earth processes of which you don't have economic explanations. So that's why I always say that it's economics plus. And what happens with economists who do risk modeling, they mainly stay with the physics of it. So which is why you can build stable scenarios. You can say 2 degrees rise, this is the impact. 4 degrees rise, this is the impact, right? And you can't model for the tipping point because it's partly chaotic and it's partly unknown. What the people who do mainly risk modeling don't read so much is paleoclimatological evidence. So for instance, the evidence that comes out of geologists studying of what's called the PETM event of 55 million years ago, right? When the temperature went up by 8 degrees over 10,000 years. Now, climate modelers sometimes treat that. But see, so the geologists are more like historians, as Paulette would say. So they have an archive. And they go and read that archive. And in a sense, their problem is that as the world gets more and more modified, the archive changes. In other words, the archive is, so they're still going to a world unmodified by human beings in order to understand previous episodes of planetary warming, right? It's possible that as we modify the planet, that archive will be lost. But anyway, but that's what they do. And actually, the risk modelers don't go into that because most of the geological evidence of tipping points are about climate disasters. And as I said, you can't make policies for disasters, right? And then there's the biological thing and the deep connection between earth processes and life processes, which Lovelock was trying to get at Gaia. Now, if you brought all of those things, then I don't think it's merely a neoliberal construct. But that our emissions have gone up with the global economy becoming neoliberal, I think that there's no disputation about that. I mean, the curves all show that.
Okay.
Were you asking whether the whole thought of the Anthropocene is a neoliberal figuration?
Yeah.
Because.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. 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 Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry. Can you?
Yeah.
Well, I would like to hear you talk a little bit about the long present because
right.
Just
but can you explain
say,
to me the neoliberal your argument again? Can you explain it? Can you explain Michael to me?
Well, she's pointing out the ways that
I wouldn't read Adam Smith as neoliberal.
What tends to be the assumption in this conversation is that we're talking about how to adapt our minds and the organization of our society to this long durée future.
Okay.
So as to stave off 4 degrees or whatever, and that it kicks in a kind of managerial temporality that is rooted in individual choices and the maintenance of this kind of freedom and the maintenance of a space that Foucault calls security for the minimal steering of actions through freedom, right? And I think that's the sense in which a lot of even radical discourse about the Anthropocene seems continuous with that.
With the continuous with discussions of individual choice, and is that what you're meaning?
Managerial, yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm
right.
there.
So, yeah.
Sorry.
But would you consider? I mean, can you just name a couple of things that would be alternatives to the managerial model? Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah, but I was just thinking,
Sorry.
I think. Just 2 quick responses. One is that, it's interesting. So when you read older books on environmentalism or environmental thinking, you know how environmentalists would often talk about the Kuznets curve with regard to pollution, right? So that Piketty makes so much of. So you pollute, and then you become rich enough to sort of take care of the pollution, and the pollution goes away. And of course, there is no Kuznets curve in climate change. The richer you get, the cleaner you get, you might actually have a worse climate change, right? And the second problem, I think, which goes probably more to the heart of what you're saying, is that, see, the reason why ultimately the discipline of, if the discipline of economics, even if it ever came to terms with costs of externalities, pricing externalities, and not just for pollution, but also for climate and all those things, I mean, then it would be very clear that the kind of affluence we now have would be unmaintainable. In other words, see, at the moment, say with coal production, the state picks up the tabs, or insurance companies, they pick up the tabs on the health costs of a lot of industrial production. I mean, like a lot of people argue that cancer is unavoidable with what industrial societies produce, right? And it's a kind of a trade-off between managing cancer and having the benefit of the creature comforts we have in our lives. So if we were to actually price all of those things and actually extended the market principle to all problems, all domains of human life, it wouldn't work. I mean, we would have a crash of the economy. And in that sense, I agree. But there's an interesting debate in the climate literature argument coming from an older debate, actually, about moral choices, where the argument is precisely, and somebody mentions Dale Jamieson yesterday, but others have made this point, that actually you cannot, and here's the problem of democracy as we think of it. Democracies, both at the individual consumer level as well as in terms of electoral cycles, are not systems suited to address questions, very long-term questions like climate change. And whereas if you think of the last 50 years, the history of decolonization, the history of decolonization is actually a history of more democratization of the world in different sense.
I think I can reframe Gina's question this way. In your first lecture about Jaspers and extremity, you used the language of extremity and danger. You did not use the language of risk.
Right.
And I think that sort of pinpoints the danger, because risk is one of these objectifying management, future projecting modes of thought.
Right.
It comes naturally to people in developed societies now to think of everything in terms of risk.
Right.
But danger is a very different concept.
I know. And,
danger is not routed through probabilities. It's not objectified. It's not scalable over long histories. It's present or it's not.
And that's why I did cite or did mention Weitzman, who is the only economist whom I've actually read on climate science, who actually says that risks are best made for low-risk scenarios. I mean, policies are best made for low-risk scenarios. So he actually says there's an inherent bias in the risk literature in favor of low-risk scenarios. And therefore, that's why when it comes to danger of tipping points, the catastrophic climate change is something they can't make policy for.
But to move away, though, from this policy-based or managerial model, I think that's what you're asking for, is if we can think not in terms of cost-benefit analysis, which I think you're still, to some extent, invoking, move away from a cost-benefit analysis or putting a value on, ecotourism or something like that. But think of it in terms of something that people would have a kind of instinctively do. I mean, I think that what is interesting is, for instance, fur is kind of uncool, to be wearing fur at this moment. I mean, some people still do, but for large segments of the population, it's uncool to wear fur. Whereas that wasn't the case, just a generation ago. So to have that kind of personal distaste, for something that's actually also ecologically, politically incorrect, let me just put it in those terms. But I think that it's good to have that kind of, a pattern of distaste in lots of us, so that, we actually have, if in fact, cows are producing 18% of the greenhouse gas, then for us to have a distaste for beef, how could that come about? That, I would say, is something that is actually outside the scope of a managerial project. It is something else, and there's no name yet for what kind of education would actually generate habits of distaste. But that would be one possibility.
But can I just quickly say, I mean, not all managers, I mean, like, for instance, if the government made the decision to actually have more public transport, and actually make it difficult for, make it easier for us not to have to rely on individual transports. I mean, those would be political questions. And it's clear in many instances that, we need to have more public transport. We need to have fewer cars. And there, a neoliberal economy militates against that kind of public choices. Right. No, I was simply making the point with that, I mean, is that if you have more people, then even if you had a non-liberal bureaucracy, you need a larger bureaucracy to manage the population. And that was my argument being that irrespective of how energy is distributed internally in a society, more people means you need more energy. How you consume it is a different question of justice.
Okay. There may be time for one more.
Yeah, well,
Thank you. I enjoyed your talk yesterday and this conversation. I missed your first lecture. I have actually 2 questions. You can answer either of them. How do we engage in a conversation about what I guess might call cult of growth? Everybody's for growth, which is just a euphemism for more per capita consumption, as you pointed out. With our obligations that we may feel about the size and the living standards of future generations. What can be the terms of that conversation? And second, in geological time that you talked about, will the climate change or even the human species appear as anything more than a barely detectable blip?
We could almost stop right there.
Right.
yeah.
Actually, the second question is perhaps pretty more easily answerable in the sense that if you took the view that we are a blip, which we are, see, there is no climate problem without concern. It's only because you feel concerned about other human beings that you feel that problem. In other words, even somebody who thinks we should think of life before humans, like Lovelock does, right. Then he says, but we need to put life before humans so that humans can actually flourish, so that humans don't harm themselves. So, so that's why I was saying that the moment we talk about dangerous climate change, we are actually speaking morally. We are not speaking just scientifically. But I have read geologists who say that, this will not lead to extinction of life. Maybe future geologists will come and say, okay, here was an event that we will name as a boundary event between the geological epoch and and the Holocene ending, and like the dinosaurs are meant to have gone out, in a period that's marked as KT extinction, right? That the KT is at the borderline, and geologists will come and give it a name. Now, but if you only read it like that, there'd be none of this discussion, right? It comes because, as I was saying, one cares. One feels committed to fellow, including future generations. And that's answering your first question. There's a very good book, actually, by a philosopher called Stephen Gardner. It's called A Perfect Moral Storm. And it takes up this whole question of the care for future generations. And actually goes through a whole lot of examples and discussions to show why it has become such a difficult question in the climate problem. That's why he says it's a perfect moral storm for a philosopher. And the chapter on cost-benefit analysis in that book is called cost-benefit paralysis.
Wait, yeah.
It would be presumptuous of me to try and end this conversation by summing up what has been an extraordinarily rich set of interventions and views and conversations and wonderful, wonderful lectures. It does seem to me that at the that one of the challenges that you issued yesterday very, very clearly, and one of the words that you used has been, we have hovered around it, but nobody has used the word this morning, and that is personhood. And the challenge of ultimately, it founds everything from neoliberal institutions to our politics and so on and so forth. And the inadequacy, the other word that rings for me is inadequacy, the inadequacy of our modes of thought, the inadequacy of our projects and so on, to cope with a challenge that requires us to think personhood in fundamentally different terms. And for you to have laid this out in ways that humanists and scientists alike, that can facilitate a conversation that can get richer and richer on this campus between humanists and scientists alike, is a huge achievement. And I want to thank you. I want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you very much.